In the quiet of a rainy evening, a desperate father walked into a grocery store, clutching the last of his pride to buy food for his starving daughter. But when the store owner accused him of theft, everything took a dark turn. The police arrived, ready to uncover the truth. What they found? It's more than just a simple misunderstanding, it's a story that will leave you questioning everything. The grocery store stood as a beacon in the drizzling evening, its warm glow spilling onto the wet pavement outside. The rain had just begun to let up, leaving the streets quiet, save for the occasional car slicing through the mist. As the automatic doors whooshed open, Jacob hesitated, feeling the blast of cool air from inside clash with the damp chill that clung to him. Jacob's clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, worn and frayed at the edges. His coat, heavy and threadbare, barely kept the cold at bay. He clutched a crumpled dollar bill in his hand, the last vestige of his pride and hope. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, his presence barely noticed by the other shoppers who moved through the aisles with ease. For Jacob, every step felt like a transgression, a reminder of a life that had slipped away. But he wasn't here for himself. He was here for Emily. Emily, his 6-year-old daughter, had become frail and gaunt in the days since they'd last had a proper meal. The thought of her weak body growing weaker by the hour drove him forward. She needed food, and he was determined to get it, no matter the cost to his pride. Jacob made his way to the bread aisle, the smell of fresh loaves filling the air. His stomach growled, but he ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. He picked up a loaf of the cheapest bread, its weight insignificant but still a symbol of sustenance. Next, he moved to the refrigerated section, where rows of milk cartons stood in neat lines. Emily loved milk, it was one of the few things that could bring a smile to her face. Jacob selected the smallest carton, calculating the cost in his head. As he approached the checkout, his heart raced, each step toward the register heavy with anxiety. The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes dulled by exhaustion, greeted him with a faltering smile. Jacob placed the bread and milk on the counter, his hand trembling as he offered the crumpled dollar bill. "Is that all for you today?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. Jacob nodded, unable to speak. He could feel the weight of the other customers' stares, their judgment searing into his back. The cashier took the bill, ringing up the items. When the total appeared, $1.89, Jacob exhaled in relief. He counted out the remaining change, his fingers steadying as he realized he had enough. Just as he handed her the coins, a shadow loomed over him. Jacob looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man behind the counter, his stern expression betraying no sympathy. The name tag on his chest read Mr. Harris. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice gruff and authoritative. "No, sir," the cashier replied quickly, though she glanced nervously at Jacob. Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized Jacob, his gaze lingering on the few items on the counter. "Are you sure about that?" His tone was laced with suspicion. Jacob's stomach twisted in fear. I just want to buy these," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Mr. Harris leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming. "I saw you wandering around the store. Looked like you were up to something." Jacob's mouth went dry. I wasn't doing anything. I just needed, what's in your pockets?" Mr. Harris cut him off, his voice sharp and accusatory. Jacob froze, his mind racing. "Nothing, I swear, I didn't take anything." His voice quivered with desperation. "Empty them," Mr. Harris demanded, his tone brooking no argument. Jacob's hands shook as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a few coins, an old receipt, and the small, worn photo of Emily. The photograph slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. The cashier gasped softly when she saw it, and even Mr. Harris's stern expression softened for a moment. Jacob quickly bent down, scooping up the picture and holding it close. The image of his daughter, smiling brightly, was his only reminder of better days. "I'm not a thief," Jacob whispered, his voice cracking. "I just want to feed my daughter." Mr. Harris's eyes bore into him, searching for any sign of deceit. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The other customers had stopped in their tracks, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. Finally, Mr. Harris stepped back, his expression hardening once more. "If you're telling the truth, you won't mind waiting until the police get here," he said coldly. Jacob's heart sank. He had no choice. All he could do was hope that when the police arrived, they would believe him. As the minutes dragged on, each one filled with a growing sense of dread, Jacob clung to the photograph of Emily, praying that this nightmare would end soon. The soft hum of the store's air conditioning was the only sound as Jacob stood frozen, his mind reeling. Mr. Harris's accusation hung in the air, a heavy cloud that seemed to suffocate him. His hands shook slightly as he clutched the photograph of Emily, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Mr. Harris crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze unwavering. "Let me see your other pockets," he demanded, his voice low but insistent. Jacob hesitated for a moment, then slowly turned out his remaining pockets. He had nothing more than what he'd already shown, coins, a receipt, and the photograph. But it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Harris, who looked at him with a mix of suspicion and contempt. "I told you," Jacob said quietly, his voice strained. "I didn't take anything." Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed. "Why don't you just tell the truth?" he said, his tone hard. "We can make this easy. Admit what you took, and maybe we can avoid bringing in the cops." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. "I swear, I didn't take anything," he pleaded. "I came here to buy food for my daughter. That's all." The mention of his daughter seemed to give Mr. Harris pause. His eyes flickered to the photograph Jacob held, the image of a little girl with a bright smile. For just a second, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the hardened exterior he wore like armor. "You expect me to believe that?" Mr. Harris shot back, his voice laced with skepticism. "You walk in here looking like you've been on the streets for weeks, and you expect me to believe you're just here to buy a loaf of bread?" Jacob fought to keep his composure. "I'm telling the truth," he said more firmly this time. "I don't have much, but I'm not a thief. I'm just trying to take care of my daughter." Before Mr. Harris could respond, the cashier, who had been silently watching, spoke up. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't see him take anything." Mr. Harris turned sharply toward her, clearly not used to being contradicted. "You sure about that, Emily?" he asked, his tone warning. Emily nodded, though there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Yes, sir. He paid for the bread and the milk, and I didn't see him pocket anything else." For a moment, the store was silent again. Mr. Harris's face hardened, and it was clear that he didn't appreciate being questioned in front of the customers. He looked back at Jacob, his expression a mix of anger and frustration. It was as if he couldn't understand why anyone would stand up for someone like Jacob, someone who, in his eyes, had already been judged and found wanting. "You might be able to fool her," Mr. Harris said, his voice low and dangerous, "but you're not fooling me." Just then, the distant wail of sirens broke through the tense silence, growing louder as they approached. The color drained from Jacob's face as the realization hit him: Mr. Harris had called the police, and they were almost here. The few customers who had lingered quickly moved out of the way, a mix of concern and morbid curiosity on their faces. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, panic starting to set in. He had nothing to hide, but the thought of being taken away, of not being able to get back to Emily, was too much to bear. His mind raced, searching for some way to make them believe him, to convince them that he was just a father trying to care for his child. But the more he thought, the more hopeless it seemed. In Mr. Harris's eyes, he was already guilty. The sirens grew louder, and soon the red and blue lights of the police car flickered through the store's windows, casting a disorienting glow across the aisles. The car pulled up to the entrance, and the store's automatic doors whooshed open once again, letting in the officers and the cold air from outside. 2 officers entered the store, their faces stern and unreadable. They took in the scene, the customers standing back, Mr. Harris with his arms crossed and a self-satisfied expression, and Jacob, standing there with his few belongings spread out on the counter, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Harris," one of the officers said as he approached, his voice calm but authoritative. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mr. Harris wasted no time, launching into an explanation of how he had seen Jacob wandering the aisles, looking suspicious, and how he was certain that Jacob had tried to steal from the store. As he spoke, Jacob felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The officer listened carefully, his eyes occasionally flicking over to Jacob, who stood there helplessly. When Mr. Harris finished, the officer nodded slowly, then turned to Jacob. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" the officer asked, his voice even. Jacob swallowed hard, finally finding his voice. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I just came here to buy some food for my daughter." The officer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he looked down at the items on the counter, the loaf of bread, the small carton of milk, the few coins, and the photograph of the little girl. "Do you have a receipt for these items?" the officer asked. Jacob shook his head, confusion creeping in. No, I didn't get a receipt," he stammered. "I gave her the money, but then," he trailed off, not sure how to explain what had happened without it sounding like an excuse. The officer glanced at Emily, who quickly nodded. "He paid for the items," she confirmed, her voice quiet but firm. "I just didn't get a chance to print the receipt before Mr. Harris came over." The officer nodded again, then turned back to Mr. Harris. "It sounds like he paid for what he took," the officer said calmly. "Is there any evidence that he took anything else?" Mr. Harris opened his mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand to stop him. "Without any evidence, there's not much we can do here," he said, his tone still calm but final. Jacob felt a wave of relief wash over him, his legs nearly giving out as the tension started to release. But the look on Mr. Harris's face made it clear that this wasn't over. He had been challenged in his own store, and he wasn't going to forget it. As the officers turned to leave, Mr. Harris's eyes bore into Jacob, a silent promise that this wasn't the last time he'd see him. The officers walked back toward the door, the tension in the store finally beginning to dissipate. But Jacob knew that things wouldn't be that simple. He had narrowly escaped being dragged into something much worse, but the damage was already done. The looks, the whispers, the way everyone had seen him, it was something he couldn't easily shake off. As the doors closed behind the officers, Jacob turned back to Emily. She offered him a weak smile, a mixture of relief and apology in her eyes. He nodded his thanks, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He gathered his things, his mind already racing with thoughts of how he could get back to Emily, how he could make it through another day. With his few items in hand, Jacob made his way to the exit, the eyes of the other customers following him all the way. The automatic doors whooshed open once more, and Jacob stepped out into the cold night air, the rain starting to fall again in a soft, steady rhythm. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, the chill seeping into his bones. As he walked away from the store, the lights and the people fading into the background, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as something less, a man defined not by his love for his daughter, but by the way others saw him. And that, more than anything, was what weighed him down as he made his way back to the shelter, hoping that Emily was still awake, hoping that he could somehow bring a smile back to her face, even if just for a moment. The night had deepened, casting long shadows across the deserted streets as the rain fell in a steady drizzle. Jacob's breath puffed out in small clouds of mist as he hurried down the sidewalk, his coat pulled tightly around him. The chill in the air cut through to his bones, but the cold was nothing compared to the anxiety gnawing at him. Every step echoed in the empty night, the city's usual hum muffled by the rain and the weight of what had just happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the encounter in the grocery store. The fear, the humiliation, the way Mr. Harris had looked at him, as if he were something less than human. Jacob had faced judgment before, plenty of it, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about Emily, too. And that made it worse. His mind raced as he walked, each thought colliding with the next. Would Mr. Harris let it go? Would the police come after him, despite what the officer had said? Jacob had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. All he could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, until he reached the shelter where Emily was waiting. But before he could get there, the sound of a car approaching from behind caught his attention. The headlights cast an eerie glow on the wet pavement, illuminating the raindrops as they fell. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing instinctively. He didn't want to look back, but something inside him forced him to. When he did, his worst fear was confirmed. The police car he had seen at the store was trailing slowly behind him, its red and blue lights flashing silently. It was as if they were following him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. Panic surged through Jacob, his breath coming faster as the reality of his situation closed in around him like a vice. For a moment, he considered running. The instinct to flee, to escape the situation, was overwhelming. But where would he go? He couldn't leave Emily. She needed him, and he had promised himself he would never abandon her, no matter how bad things got. And so, with a deep breath, Jacob forced himself to keep walking, his pace steady, his head down. The police car continued to follow him, its presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of his situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car pulled up beside him, the window rolling down with a quiet buzz. Jacob stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, as one of the officers from the store leaned out, his expression unreadable. "Jacob, right?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a hint of familiarity, as if they were old acquaintances rather than strangers. Jacob nodded, unable to find his voice. His throat was tight, his body frozen with fear. The officer, noticing his tension, softened his tone slightly. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" the officer continued. It wasn't really a question, and Jacob knew it. With a resigned sigh, Jacob nodded again and took a few hesitant steps toward the car. The officer got out, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. He was a tall man, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen too much. His name tag read _Daniels_. Officer Daniels. "Look, I know what happened back at the store," Officer Daniels began, his tone calm and measured. "Mr. Harris called us, said he thought you were stealing. But from what I can see, you didn't take anything. You paid for what you bought. That's all we care about." Jacob swallowed, his mouth dry. "I didn't steal anything," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I'm just trying to get food for my daughter. That's all I wanted." Officer Daniels nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I believe you," he said, surprising Jacob. "But I've got to ask, why are you out here? Where are you headed?" Jacob hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in Officer Daniels' demeanor told him that he might actually listen, might actually care. "I'm going back to the shelter," Jacob admitted. "My daughter's there. I need to get back to her." Officer Daniels' gaze softened as he looked at Jacob, really looked at him for the first time. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. "How old is she?" he asked. "6, Jacob replied, the word catching in his throat. "Her name's Emily. She's all I have." The officer nodded again, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "That's tough," he said, his voice low. "It's not easy, doing what you're doing. Taking care of her on your own." Jacob didn't know how to respond to that. It wasn't often that anyone acknowledged what he was going through, let alone with any kind of empathy. Most people just saw the ragged clothes, the unshaven face, and assumed the worst. But here was this officer, a man who had every reason to treat him like a criminal, speaking to him like a human being. "I'm not here to give you a hard time, Jacob," Officer Daniels continued. "I just want to make sure you're okay, that your daughter's okay. That's all." Jacob looked down at the ground, his emotions swirling inside him. He didn't know if he could trust this man, didn't know if he should. But he also knew he had nothing left to lose. So, with a deep breath, he looked up and met Officer Daniels' gaze. "We're okay," he said, though the words felt like a lie. They weren't okay. They were barely hanging on. But what else could he say? What else was there to say? The officer studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke again. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do to help?" The question took Jacob by surprise. It had been so long since anyone had offered him anything other than a cold shoulder or a scornful glance. The idea that someone, anyone, might actually want to help him was almost too much to process. We just need a place to stay," Jacob admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe, where Emily can sleep and where I can figure things out." Officer Daniels nodded slowly. "The shelter you're staying at, how long have you been there?" "Not long," Jacob replied. "We've been moving around a lot. It's hard to stay in one place for too long." "I understand," Officer Daniels said. He paused, thinking for a moment before speaking again. "There's a place I know, a little better than the usual shelters. It's a bit out of the way, but they're good people. They might be able to help you and your daughter get back on your feet." Jacob felt a flicker of hope, though he tried to tamp it down. He had been let down too many times to let hope take root easily. "Why would you do that for us?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The officer gave a small, tired smile. "Because I've seen too many people slip through the cracks, Jacob. And I don't want that to happen to you and your little girl." Jacob didn't know what to say. The offer of help, genuine help, was something he hadn't expected. He looked at Officer Daniels, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but all he found was sincerity. "Okay," Jacob said finally, the word heavy with the weight of his decision. "Okay." Officer Daniels nodded, as if he had expected this answer all along. "Come on, then," he said, gesturing toward the police car. "I'll give you a ride. No strings attached." Jacob hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. He followed the officer to the car, his steps tentative, but the fear that had gripped him earlier was beginning to fade, replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A glimmer of trust, maybe. Or hope. He wasn't sure yet. As he got into the car, Jacob couldn't help but glance back at the street, at the path he had been walking alone just moments ago. The rain continued to fall, the city still as quiet and cold as ever. But now, with the warmth of the car around him and the promise of a new possibility, that cold didn't seem quite so unbearable. The ride was quiet, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows the only noise between them. Jacob leaned back in the seat, his thoughts racing, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't entirely dark. There was something else there now, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in too long. And as they drove through the rain-soaked streets, heading toward whatever came next, Jacob held onto that feeling, fragile as it was. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he had a chance. And that was more than he'd had in a long time. The police car glided through the wet streets, the headlights cutting through the misty night. Inside, the warmth from the heater slowly thawed the chill that had settled deep into Jacob's bones. He sat in silence, his hands resting in his lap, fingers still curled around the edges of the photograph he had held onto so tightly in the store. The edges were worn and soft, almost like the memory itself, fading but still there, still real. Officer Daniels kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes words weren't necessary. Jacob watched the city pass by through the rain-streaked windows, the familiar streets looking different in the glow of the streetlights. For once, he wasn't out in the cold, wandering these streets alone, and that was enough to let him relax just a little. As they approached the shelter, Jacob's thoughts drifted back to Emily. He wondered if she was asleep, curled up in one of the thin blankets they'd been given. He imagined her small face, peaceful in sleep, the worry lines that had become too frequent on her young face smoothed out for a time. The image was a comfort, but it was also a reminder of why he was doing all of this, why he kept pushing forward, even when it felt impossible. The shelter came into view, a squat, unremarkable building tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood. The lights inside were dim, but still on, casting a faint glow through the curtained windows. Officer Daniels pulled the car to a stop just outside the entrance, the engine humming softly before he cut it off. Jacob hesitated, his hand on the door handle, before glancing back at Officer Daniels. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for what the officer had done for him tonight. Daniels turned to him, a small, kind smile on his face. "You don't need to thank me, Jacob. Just take care of your little girl, okay? That's all that matters." Jacob nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, the rain having slowed to a gentle drizzle. As he stood there, the car door open, he felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. There was something about the quiet kindness of this officer that made him want to reach out, to ask for more help, to admit just how lost he felt. But the words stuck in his throat, and instead, he just nodded again and closed the door behind him. As Jacob walked toward the shelter, the sound of the police car pulling away echoed in the stillness. He felt the familiar weight of his situation settle back onto his shoulders as he pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The warmth of the shelter was a stark contrast to the night outside, and for a moment, Jacob just stood there, letting it soak into his cold, tired body. The main room of the shelter was quiet, most of the occupants already asleep in their assigned spots. A few stray voices murmured in the background, but otherwise, the room was still. Jacob moved through the dimly lit space, his eyes scanning the rows of makeshift beds until he found the one where Emily lay. She was curled up under a thin blanket, her small body barely making a dent in the mattress. Her face was turned away from the door, but even from here, Jacob could see the rise and fall of her chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Relief washed over him, she was safe, at least for tonight. Jacob sat down on the edge of the mattress, careful not to wake her. The photograph was still in his hand, and he looked at it again, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of her face in the picture. It was taken just before everything had fallen apart, back when they still had a home, a life that didn't involve shelter hopping and constant fear. Emily was smiling, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that only children seemed capable of. It was a joy that had become rare these days, but seeing it in the picture brought Jacob a small measure of comfort. He slipped the photograph back into his pocket, then gently brushed a strand of hair from Emily's face. She stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep, but didn't wake. Jacob's heart ached as he looked at her, so young, so fragile, yet so much stronger than he ever imagined Ella would need to be. As he sat there, the events of the night played over in his mind. Mr. Harris's accusations, the fear that had gripped him, the unexpected kindness from Officer Daniels, it was all a blur, yet each moment felt significant, like the pieces of a puzzle that had yet to come together. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had made it through the night. And that was something. Jacob finally lay down beside Emily, careful not to disturb her. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but it was better than the cold, wet ground outside. He pulled the blanket over them both, the warmth of her small body a comfort against the lingering chill in his bones. His mind, however, refused to quiet, the thoughts racing even as exhaustion pulled at him. He thought about what Officer Daniels had said, about the place that might be able to help them. The idea of a stable, safe place for Emily was almost too much to hope for, yet it was all he could think about. Could it really be true? Could there be a place where they wouldn't have to worry about where they'd sleep each night, where the next meal would come from? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As sleep finally began to creep in, Jacob made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find Officer Daniels. He would ask about that place, see if there was any truth to the promise of help. He didn't know what it would take or how far they'd have to go, but he would do whatever it took to give Emily a better life. He owed her that much. Jacob's last thoughts before sleep claimed him were of Emily's smile, of the way her eyes lit up when she was happy. He would find that smile again, he promised himself. No matter how long it took, no matter what he had to do, he would bring that light back to her eyes. And with that promise in his heart, Jacob drifted off to sleep, the sound of rain outside the shelter a quiet lullaby that carried him into the darkness of his dreams. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, one that didn't end in despair, but in hope. Morning light crept into the shelter, diffused through the worn curtains that hung over the small windows. The sun's weak rays fell on the floor in pale rectangles, touching the faces of the few who were already stirring from sleep. The air was still, the quiet punctuated only by the soft rustle of blankets and the occasional cough. Jacob awoke slowly, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him as he blinked into the dim light. For a moment, he didn't move, letting the reality of where he was and what he had to do today settle in. Emily was still curled up beside him, her tiny form barely noticeable under the blanket. Her breathing was slow and steady, her face peaceful. He watched her for a moment, a sense of calm washing over him despite the anxiety that buzzed just beneath the surface. Last night's events felt like a bad dream, something that couldn't possibly have happened to him. But the memory of Mr. Harris's accusations, the police car's flashing lights, and Officer Daniels's offer were all too real. They weighed on him heavily, but mixed with that weight was the faintest glimmer of hope. Careful not to wake Emily, Jacob slipped out of bed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. The shelter was starting to come to life around him, a few people moving about quietly, gathering their things for the day. The place was never bustling, but in the morning light, it seemed less daunting, less oppressive. The night's cold had been chased away by the sun, and the room had warmed up slightly, the lingering scent of instant coffee filling the air. Jacob's thoughts were a jumble, but one thing was clear, he had to find Officer Daniels. The officer had offered a chance, a way out, and Jacob couldn't afford to let it slip through his fingers. He owed it to Emily to try. He had to find out if the place Daniels mentioned was real, and if it was, he needed to know how to get there. He gathered his few belongings, stuffing them into the worn-out backpack he had carried with him through too many long days and nights. As he did, he heard the creak of a door behind him and turned to see Emily waking up, her small hand rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She blinked at him, her expression still groggy with sleep. "Daddy," she mumbled, her voice thick with drowsiness. "Hey, sweetheart," Jacob said softly, moving back to sit beside her. He smoothed her tangled hair back from her face, his heart swelling with a mix of love and worry. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded, then yawned, the kind of deep, unself-conscious yawn that only children seem to manage. "Are we leaving soon?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Yeah, soon," Jacob replied. He tried to keep his tone light, not wanting to burden her with the uncertainty that weighed on him. "But first, we're going to see someone who might be able to help us find a better place to stay." Emily's eyes brightened at that. "Really? A better place?" Jacob smiled, though it was tinged with the sadness of knowing how much she had already endured in her short life. "Yeah, maybe. We just have to see if we can find him first." They ate a quick breakfast of stale bread and instant coffee, the only options available at the shelter that morning. Jacob barely tasted the food, his mind already focused on the task ahead. He wasn't even sure where to begin looking for Officer Daniels. The city was big, and the officer's kindness felt like a fleeting thing, something that could disappear if Jacob didn't act quickly. After breakfast, they left the shelter, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city damp but refreshed. The streets glistened under the weak sunlight, and the air was sharp with the clean scent of rain-washed concrete. Jacob pulled his coat tighter around Emily, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they began to walk. They wandered the streets for hours, Jacob's eyes scanning every corner, every passing car, hoping to spot the familiar blue and white of a police vehicle. The hours stretched on, each one chipping away at the fragile hope that had carried him through the night. Emily was patient, holding his hand as they walked, but he could see the fatigue starting to weigh her down. By midday, Jacob was ready to give up. His feet ached, and his stomach grumbled in protest. The city felt too big, too indifferent, and he began to wonder if he had imagined the officer's kindness, if he had built it up in his mind because he was desperate for something good, something different. But then, as they rounded a corner, Jacob saw a police car parked at the end of the block, its lights off, the engine idling quietly. His heart leapt into his throat, and he hurried forward, pulling Emily along with him. As they approached, he saw the figure of a man leaning against the car, looking down at a small notebook in his hands. "Officer Daniels!" Jacob called out, his voice cracking with a mix of hope and desperation. The man looked up, and for a moment, Jacob's heart sank as he realized it wasn't Daniels. But then the man turned slightly, revealing the officer sitting in the driver's seat, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw Jacob. "Jacob," Officer Daniels said as he stepped out of the car, his voice carrying that same calm, reassuring tone from the night before. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." Jacob stopped in front of him, Emily at his side, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. All the words he had rehearsed in his head on their long walk evaporated under the weight of the reality before him. He simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Officer Daniels glanced at Emily, then back at Jacob. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently. Jacob swallowed hard and finally found his voice. "You mentioned a place," he began, his words halting, "a place that might help us. I didn't know where else to go." Daniels' expression softened even more. "I'm glad you came to find me," he said. "I was going to check in on you later today, but this is even better." Jacob's breath hitched at the officer's words. He had planned to come back for them? The idea was almost too much to believe, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in Daniels' eyes. "There's a place," Daniels continued, nodding toward the car. "It's not far, and it's a good place. They've helped a lot of families like yours get back on their feet. I can take you there, introduce you to the people who run it. They'll make sure you're safe, and that Emily has what she needs." Jacob's eyes welled up, and he blinked hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Daniels nodded, his own eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Everyone deserves a chance, Jacob. Let's get you that chance." The ride to the shelter was quiet, but this time, it was a quiet filled with a different kind of tension, a hopeful anticipation. Jacob held Emily close as the city streets passed by outside the window, the world suddenly seeming a little less cold, a little less daunting. When they arrived, Jacob was struck by how ordinary the place looked, just another building on a quiet street. But when they stepped inside, he was immediately greeted by warmth, by the sounds of laughter and conversation. The walls were lined with children's drawings, and the air smelled of freshly baked bread. A woman approached them, her smile kind and welcoming. "You must be Jacob," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Linda, the director here. Officer Daniels told us you might be coming by." Jacob shook her hand, feeling the last of his tension begin to melt away. "This is Emily," he said, his voice steadier now. "She's all I have." Linda crouched down to Emily's level, her smile widening. "Hi, Emily. We're so glad you're here. How about we get you something to eat? And maybe find you a nice place to rest?" Emily looked up at Jacob, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and relief. He nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile, and she returned it, the first genuine smile he had seen on her face in what felt like forever. As Linda led Emily away, Officer Daniels placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're in good hands now," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Take this time to rest, to figure things out. You're not alone anymore." Jacob nodded, a deep sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than fear, something other than despair. He felt hope. Real, tangible hope. As he watched Emily disappear down the hallway with Linda, Jacob allowed himself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in what felt like years. The weight of the world had been lifted, if only slightly, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that they might just make it after all. And as the sun continued to rise outside, casting its warm light through the windows, Jacob knew that they were finally on the path to something better, a place where they could rebuild, where Emily could smile without the shadow of fear, where they could both find peace. And that, he realized, was everything he had been searching for all along.